So hello and welcome everybody to A Space for Place, where we'll be looking at the role of place and where it fits in with storytelling. It might sound like a very broad and vague topic, which is why I'm very fortunate to be joined by a whole bunch of experts here who are very talented and very specific in their own approach and style for these things. So I thought to kick things off, what we'd do is I'd ask a question and get each of you to introduce yourselves as you answer it, so as to make it a little simpler. So I guess in starting off, to give a bit of context to things, can you tell us what place means to you and what role you feel it has? What is place to you? I'm going to suggest we start with Ruth, since on screen, according to me, she's right next to me. It's like the Brady Bunch.
Great, thanks, Chris. Well, I'm an architect. I'm probably the oddball amongst everyone here, but I do write about place. And for me, you can think of place as fitting into four broad theoretical categories, if you like. I'm going to be the theory person here. So there's a place as natural essence. You may have heard the term genius loci, and this is the idea of place as being inseparable from existence, that to exist is to exist in a place. And the idea that, maybe places have a spirit that are quintessentially part of what makes that place a place. Then there's what I would call space, place as experiential phenomenon. So this is the idea that our experiences, our lived experience of somewhere is what gives it that quality of having a place. Then there's probably the idea of maybe what you would call assemblage theory. So this is the idea that if you imagine a place or a location as being quantitatively different for everybody who lives in that place, experiences that place, and therefore the properties of that place emerge from these interconnections between the different parts. That would be place as assemblage. And finally, for me, there's the idea of as place as being a social construct. And this is very much around the idea that if a person can have multiple identities depending on who you're talking to and who you're interacting with, so a place can have multiple identities. And this is very much caught up in the kind of social interactions that go on in that place. I hope that's not too long an answer.
That's good. I mean, it gives us that bit of context to start off. What about for the rest of you? I guess, especially in terms of approaching your comics, what does place mean to you?
Who do you want to start with?
Who would like to go? Let's go.
I'll go next, I guess. I'm Alison Sampson, and I draw comics, and I'm also an architect, which is where I know Ruth from. And the comics I've done are all pretty much heavily rooted in place. And there's Winnebago Graveyard, that's the American Southwest, and Hit Girl in Mumbai, which is in Mumbai, and then currently Sleeping Beauties, which is in West Virginia, and the future stuff, which some of which is in places that I'm going to make up. And place for me is, depending if it's invented or made up or somebody else's life or whatever, it's kind of a conurbation of experiences. So, for example, when I was starting to do Hit Girl in Mumbai, I couldn't go to Mumbai, but there's a lot of people from India and indeed Mumbai in this country and sort of amongst my friends group. And I talked to them, and it was like, the guy said, I took my mother's ashes to Mumbai, and I was like, what do you think of that? And it's that kind of, this sort of layers of this that make the place. And I was very keen that I actually showed Mumbai as it was, not what people think it is. And so there's also that as well. But say, for example, if I'm inventing it, it's still a conurbation of people's experiences. It's just a conurbation of experiences that I also have to invent. And that's that's yet to come. Or, for example, if I'm working with a collaborator who is on the far side of the world and has a different set of experiences, I'll be mining those. So that's my idea of place.
So how about for you, Alex? What is place to you?
Well, thanks. Hi, I'm Alex Paknadel. I'm a comic writer, but I have an academic background, actually at the same institution as Ruth. I did a PhD on J.G. Ballard and nostalgia. So, my stuff is sort of riddled with place, really. But also, I mean, personally, I have quite a complicated relationship, I think, with place, because I'm sort of the grandchildren of refugees. So, place for me, I mean, particularly sort of essentialist readings of place are actually very scary. The idea that place can be freighted with all sorts of notions of romantic nationalism rather than sort of civic nationalism. I find that all quite disconcerting. So I find myself sort of most comfortable writing about fictional places, because then they're not necessarily sort of anchored to those essentialist readings. But also, I mean, personally, I find that I'm most comfortable in places that have significant kind of transient populations. When I deal with sort of notions of, when there are sort of very sort of in settled communities, I think particularly, now that we're in the sort of 21st century and all those issues are being raised, I think there's a lot of scope for some quite sort of alarming trends. So, yeah, I think place now, particularly home, are quite sort of problematic. So, yeah, I mean, I would prefer the sort of, I prefer to think of place as a sort of theatre of tensions, I guess.
And how about for you, Lonnie? What's your sort of approach to play?
Yeah, first off, my name's Lonnie Nadler. I'm a comic book writer. I'm not an architect, and I do not have a PhD. So my thoughts on this are perhaps less valid than the others. But I guess for me, place, I think of it in three ways that are all sort of interconnected. There's external physical space, which is obviously the setting of a book. Then there's the metaphysical space, the interior space of the character that they're inhabiting, which can in turn be influenced by physical space. And then the third one is sort of the space of the body that we inhabit, which is sort of the connectivity between the physical and metaphysical space. And so these are things that I try to explore in my work often, and that's why in my books like The Dregs or Black Stars Above, you see space almost as a conscious thing that interacts with the metaphysical space of the characters. And this is something I didn't think about at all until I was asked to be part of this panel. So it's been sort of eye-opening for me to consider these things. I guess, yeah, that's the long and short of it.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it's the unconscious stuff as well that goes in and that you unpack in something like this. I guess if we could have Ron do a bit of unpacking of some of his approach, that'd be fascinating as well.
Yeah, my name's Ronald Wimberly. I'm a cartoonist, writer, cartoonist. My approach to space, I acknowledge everything that Ruth and Alison said, and Alex as well. I guess my approach is indifferent in maybe two ways, or to articulate, how specifically I approach spaces. I choose spaces that are connected to some sort of a cultural, like highly essentialized, possibly. Like I kind of want to problematize any essentialist notion. So for the same reason, I maybe avoid like a high fantasy or like a completely imagined space, because my work, I'm very concerned with problematizing essentialist notions of space and identity, and even works in general. So like in Prince of Cats, which is a book I did, which is kind of like it's I call it the B-side of Romeo and Juliet, but and it takes place in New York City, and it centers Tybalt as opposed to the love story. And New York City, placing it in New York City and placing that particular work with certain characters like street characters is meant to problematize a sort of essential notion both of the work, for Americans, and Americans look at Shakespeare, it's like a high esteem. It's like kind of, fancy literature, kind of, not really, but like I said something about Americans, but like that's kind of how we we view the works, sacred works. And also like Venice or, like Florence, sort of these classical locations of classical Western art. Placing these events within the context of 80s New York, I intend to like complicate those essentialist notions of either, but materially, I dealing with all the same problems that you mentioned, and also spatially the page. Like for me, when I'm thinking about space and location, I'm also thinking about how things are situated on the page in relation to each other and in relation to each other within the book. Those things are also very important to me because like, I guess in that case, time comes into play as well. I don't know if I just made it more confusing, but
well, it's good. The idea of this is, I guess, to lend a bit of context to everything that we say after. And I think it makes sense now for us to sort of pose this question to Emma, because like Alison and Ruth at the beginning, she also has the architectural background. So it's a nice framework for the building there.
Yeah, well, hello, I'm Emma. Well, here's Michael. I'm a cartoonist, and yeah, I work mostly on fantasy and science fiction. My most famous book is Pretty Deadly, which is actually a very American-centric book. But the way I approach this from my point of view, it's that basically place to me is more connected with atmospheres and immersion and things that make you feel like culturally alike than a place itself, like a setting. So to me, for example, I'm from a small village, fishing village. So probably I get, as Spain as a country is very multicultural. So I probably feel closer to somebody who has grown there in a similar way than to other, like maybe from Canada, from a small fishing village from Canada with similar atmosphere and stuff, than maybe to people from the center of Spain or from the south. It's an awkward feeling. Also, like the weather and in general, it's like the atmosphere is like, I think that affects me a lot, and I try to bring that to my comics. Like, for example, working on Pretty Deadly, which is a Western. We started being a Western, but then we moved it in Prime, and it happened in France as well, and then in Hollywood. And it's not that it's close to my own culture or my own heritage from where I live. It's basically that, I can find points in common with the stuff we're working on, and I'm even like introducing stuff from my area, like from Galicia, like in the first arc, the Cantares de Ciego, which is basically something from here that worked perfectly there, which was like a panel with the strips, and the blind man was telling the story like that, and it worked perfectly inside the Western. So we are making up a mythology there, and even if we are using like all the elements we are using are very American, it feels like I can feel very attached to them, like as if from some kind of universal language or I don't know, like it's not that difficult to me to feel reflected there. So yeah, to me, what I want to work in comics is like to create like a place in which, like, when you are reading my stuff, or when you are like observing the drawings, or getting into it, like that you actually dive into it, that you feel that you went somewhere else, or that you feel like that you could imagine, for example, a corner in a city for one of my comics, like that it wasn't like that generic, no? Like something that you can imagine in your head by diving it slowly, like in the pages, like through the story or through the drawings. I don't know if that makes much sense, but it's like my favorite books, like, for example, kind of are very sensorial. Like I like manga a lot, and they work very well with that. I'm not talking about drawing backgrounds in every panel. Like, I think that's lazy and it doesn't work. I'm talking more about like trying to build some kind of mood or atmosphere that tries to be special for that book in particular. So that's what I am for with my work.
No, that makes sense about place giving atmosphere. And certainly I think everyone's touched on the idea of how, place is related to identity often. And so I wanted to ask each of you about how your approach to place sort of has been defined by the place that you are, or the place that you come from, and the places that you've inhabited in the time since. So, not all of us are necessarily in the place where we first started out, etc. But there are those commonalities, like Emma was saying, where you can be, in a fishing village in Spain and maybe relate to someone in a fishing village, in the wilds of Canada or something. So I think touching on that would be interesting.
I don't know, but I don't know if we can do this, like cut conversation to make it more fluid or not. But just a moment, that's like the idea is like I can feel like culturally close to someone that, for example, grew up like with Kurosawa films, like me. Not that exactly, like I don't. For me, like my experience as a Spanish person is like I'm not fond of my flag or of my, I'm of the idea of countries or various like that. So I don't know. It's like, to me, it feels like that. But it's true that I never had any trouble because of my own nationality or race. So it's normal. It's like a kind of different approach than, for example, what Ron does, which is amazing. Like.
Where I guess identity is not a country. It's like identity could be the fact that everyone's a comics person or whatever. That's one of the commonalities. Sorry, I jumped in there.
I was gonna say where I'm at now with my work is like I wouldn't even want an audience to. I wouldn't I don't think too much about what my particular where I'm from Washington D.C., but I've lived here in New York for about like 23 years, and a lot of my works are based in and around the places that I've lived, and it's coincidental. It's maybe lazy because there are details that I can kind of comment on, think about, and that are important to me because like I'm here. But I think the only use I'm only going to draw from things or use things that are useful to say something, particularly in the story or about the topics involved. Like I'm not so interested in. I would like to be aware enough about how my background influences me so that I'm not being, so that I'm being deliberate about the things that I do and not accidentally just, which I'm sure I am, but I try to avoid like accidentally taking things for granted in these sort of the farces that I produce, or the things that I,
Yeah, you said that's lazy, and your work is anything but lazy. I mean, it's like It's
No,
like
but
so thoughtful, dude.
I'm trying not to be lazy.
No, not at all. I mean, so thoughtful, and it's like the approach you have to things is like so careful and detailed. So don't say. I just wanted to say.
Well, I'm saying it's easier if you have if I can look, if I'm talking about, say if I'm talking about New York today, first of all, there's a sort of a social and cultural memory about this place, even for people who haven't been here. And I can use that I can either, try to destroy that and antagonize that notion, but it's something that's there, and also it's there for me. And it's, it requires some imagination to see it freshly, but it doesn't require imagination to construct, I'm not talking about, when I have to do something where I have to dive into the history of something to find those small details, it's labor intensive. If I want to talk about, I don't know, I was talking to a homegirl. If I wanted to do a comic of, I don't know, Soviet post, early Soviet Russia, it's like, okay, so there are little details that for my own sort of connecting to the practice of building this time in this place, I'm going to want to know these little details. Like what are the trees that are there? I can make up trees, certainly. But I think from my own experience and practice, I kind of want to know, well, what is the foliage like there? What are they drinking? If somebody goes down to whatever, pub or whatever, are there pubs there? You know what I mean? For me, and it has less to do with what the work is going to do for the audience, because I don't know for the audience and how it relates to me. It's whatever is useful for the spectacle that I'm presenting to them. It doesn't matter if it's, well researched or not. But for me, in my experience of making it, it matters.
Yeah, I get it.
I mean, setting, I think, is a really interesting one, just because, I mean, sorry, do you mind? Is that okay?
Please.
Okay. I think, I mean, a lot of it is, let's face it, it's rural and urban, right? But I think I'm really interested in sort of the difference between sort of, I guess, plastic places, not plastic in the sense of being synthetic, but, where there's a level of plasticity, where they're kind of protean, where they change all the time. And contrasted with places that are, there's an expectation that they're going to be static, which can also lead to a sort of element of theme parkization, I guess. I mean, if that's even a term. But I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I grew up in East London, and that's very much kind of a staging area for kind of immigrant communities, and that's certainly where my family comes from. Our kind of Arthurian legend is Table Street, where we kind of, not we, but grandfather's generation, beat back Oswald Mosley and the black shirts, but that place, there's a sort of, I mean, I have a very kind of romantic attachment to it in its very fluidity, in its lack of kind of fixity or fixedness, if you like. And when that place started to become uncomfortable, actually, when it was gentrified, and it became a kind of predominantly white area of London, predominantly sort of white Anglo-Saxon area of London. And I remember sort of going back to my childhood home a long time ago, which is now part of a convention centre called Excel. And it's now, what was, it was the city dump and, the docks. And I mean, I don't want to kind of romanticize kind of, grime or anything, but, it's where I grew up. And it's now this sort of, it's this huge kind of convention center where a lot of comic conventions are held. And I remember sort of, I called my mom, and I hadn't been back for about 15 years. And I said to my mom, what's going on here? And I mean, she said to me, a world without shadows is a world without depth. And it just reminded me of that first time that I kind of went to New York, and I went to Times Square. And it was a couple of years after it had been, after Disney, I think, had bought it or whatever. And, don't get me wrong. I mean, I know, it was a source of misery for a lot of people, but I kind of wanted to see that kind of Times Square where, you can kind of, get the clap from a lamppost or something. You know, I kind of wanted to see that, and instead it was, you know, I think that, you know, there's a price for kind of freezing places, if you know what I mean, where you lose that kind of plasticity, where they cease to be fluid.
Yeah, well, in New York, there's a price to I think economic, like capitalism. It's useful for something to be the same. It's like if you get 2 jars of spaghetti or you get 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, and they're different and they're changing, which they are, right? It's harder to sell that, which back to that sort of problematizing an essential notion of what a place is, you know?
Yeah. And yet there's this premium on Mexican Coke, right? Like that's kind of, there's an aura like around, like, oh, that's like real Coke.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it's good.
I guess this kind of comes back to origins and
whereas say Ron is from New York, I'm basically from nowhere. So yeah. So
well, I'm here. I feel like I'm from nowhere too, because like if you weren't born and raised in New York, it doesn't matter if you got here when you were 5 years old. You're never from here.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I feel uncomfortable.
I mean,
you know, like,
Yeah.
No,
It's
sorry.
that thing of
I'm basically from a piece of farmland on the northeast coast near where Thought Bubble is, and it's basically just an empty field.
I think it's this stuff like that. You get more connected with the community you have close, and the small cities, and not the small cities, but the small places, neighborhoods, whatever. No, that you feel more attached to that. I don't know. Like one of the reasons I think I work on science fiction and fantasy stuff is because I'm basically quite an introverted, so it's not easy to me to speak plainly about my own life or my own experience. So I find it more comfortable to work through that stuff about what worries me and so on. So yeah, and now I was talking to you about this, but the new book I'm doing is basically here in where I live in Galicia, the northwest coast of Spain. Of course, it's all made up, but originally it's some kind of isekai, like this stuff, like something happens here and it turns upside down, but originally it's here, and I'm bringing lots of elements, but it doesn't feel actually that way. It would feel that way to other people maybe, but I don't know. Like, it's a weird thing to think about. And also, like, being an architect, I feel that most of the time, like when people connect architecture and comics, they do it in a very frivolous way, like, oh, they used this famous building or they used this famous chair. I mean, I feel like that what's important is like to create precisely the place by kind of doing some kind of urbanism, like make things alive, like not just using random things disconnected. Like, to me, architecture was not only like building things, like try to create a relationship with people, or at least when I was working on that, I was very worried about thinking about how people would interact inside those things or inside those places, instead of thinking about, oh, I want this to be beautiful. Of course, that too, but at the same time. So it happens to me, like, for example, even working in science fiction, like there's something that I call drunken sci-fi, that is like when everything can happen. Like there's a ninja and a crocodile and everything put together, like in this city, which can be like New York, but also can be Tokyo, and, you know, all together, like that it feels precisely like nowhere. So maybe that can work, but maybe it can't. So I prefer, like, you know, like showing things like as flashy, like try to grow the sentiment of having something solid in the story, like that you are traveling somewhere through the narrative, instead of like super nice drawings, or I don't know if that makes sense. The other day, precisely, like I think we mentioned the Shoujo manga. The Shoujo manga doesn't have backgrounds at all, basically. but they can grow a very thick atmosphere that even inside the minds of the characters becomes a place. So that's what I look for somehow. Not precisely that, because I don't have space and I don't have the ability to do that, but I need to draw everything like but yeah, it's like more, I think that there's something interesting there.
Could I follow on from what Emma said? And this is another architectural connection, but my last book was about visitor centres, and what I thought, so this was a building type that I studied a lot. And what I found was really interesting about visitor centres is that they tend to be located in really exceptional places. So places that, whatever this sense of place is, it has it in abundance. I think Alex used the term about some places being particularly thick. And, where you have a visitor centre, say Stonehenge, it's a very placey kind of place. So first of all, you have the problem as an architect, which is how do you design for such an exceptional place? How on earth can you design a building that responds to that? But then the other problem you have is you have visitors who kind of just come for a day. They're incredibly transient. And how do you communicate what is so special about this place to someone who is just there for such a short period of time? And I suddenly thought this is probably a bit like, someone coming and reading your graphic novel. This is to all of you graphic novel creators out there, is that the person coming to read the novel is such a transient visitor, and they're coming to visit this exceptional place that you have recreated in your work. And how is it that you can communicate everything that's so exceptional about this place to someone who's just visiting for such a short period of time, whereas you've been inhabiting that place? So this is what I'd love to ask you.
I think it's presumptuous to have a really set notion of what I'm going to communicate about anything,
Totally.
And it was a rough road getting to this place, thinking like I do now. Like it's not how I've always thought. And I think if someone visits me, when I even if I'm going to show them like my town, I think I fail when I want to just run them through a bunch of different things and explain all these. And I win when we just like go for a walk, and let them be in the space, There's a lot, it doesn't mean that I don't still try, to kind of, but when I'm on game, when I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, like I let that go,
I don't know. I can say that when I read your comics, I really feel that I'm somewhere, like somewhere solid, like I feel. So the work works, like at least for me, that this thing.
Thank you.
it feels different. Like I mean, it's very different from where I live or from my experience. But I can feel kind of, it, from a point of view, it's relatable. I can understand.
It's that expression like the personal is universal or something. I forget how it goes. Some expression.
Yeah.
It's an aphorism anyway. But I think
I don't know. There are some works that really work like that. Like I don't know. It comes to my mind. I don't know. Me, A Bike on a Road, like by Eleanor Davis. I don't know if you read it. It's a travel on a bicycle. It's amazing. I just like the work. It's by Koyama. And it's like very simply drawn. And it's like it's a travel on bike from a part of America that I have no idea at all. And I felt almost as if I could be breathing there, like aside from learning a lot about the place through that person's point of view, in this case, Eleanor. I don't know. It's like, how can she manage to show so much with so little, like that? It's more like a matter of, in my head, it's like more like a matter of how you tell the stuff instead of showing it. Like more like a matter of that you are putting your own experience there and you're able to communicate your own experience through the pacing or, more in the gathers than in the panels. I don't know how to explain it. Or more like that.
I mean, I think one of the really interesting things that comics can do over perhaps other mediums is abridge time and space to perhaps kind of reveal essence or latent content. I mean, it took me a long time to kind of realize that I was sort of as obsessed with people like Ben Catchor and Seth as I was. But, you know, I mean, like, you know, Seth's Canada isn't, I don't think it could be kind of physically located, but, you know, Seth builds these kind of models that he then uses for reference to kind of build these kind of very kind of glacial, I mean, probably kind of caricatured to an extent, but these kind of glacial kind of Canadian sort of small cities. But they're very kind of tactile, and you get a definite sense of place for them. And, you know, Ben Catchor kind of, you know, has invented cities from kind of whole cloth. I mean, they're to an extent, you know, there's a little bit of New York in there, there's a little bit of Chicago in there, but it allows you, I think, to foreground certain things that aren't necessarily kind of, you know, spatially and temporally kind of proximate. And it reminded me of, you know, there were these sort of, you know, I think it was a romantic sort of affectation, but, you know, there were some sort of landscapes of Venice, you know, where people would sort of, where certain artists would just sort of bring certain buildings forward and background others, you know, entirely fictional, but in a weird way, it kind of reveals the essence of the place more than a photograph ever could. And I think that's something that you can do in comics quite spectacularly. Peters and Schwitan as well, you know, the Obscure Cities series, you know, what they do with post-war urbanism, it's kind of a higher, it's using the comics medium about real places to tell higher truths about those places.
It's interesting when you say that. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, well, it's kind of weird because everyone's bringing up examples of like other people's works, and I'm going to talk about mine. So I feel bad about it. But like to Alex, to your point, like the first book I did called The Dregs was largely a reaction to me moving from the east coast of Canada to the west coast, and seeing the difference in the city, and to seeing the reaction to homelessness and poverty and drug addiction on the streets.
Well, dude, so super quick. Now that makes perfect sense, because I remember when that came up, you know, one of the things that, you know, was observed about Toronto was like the lack of kind of homeless people in Toronto. And then I was speaking to a guy from Toronto who said, oh yeah, they all moved to Vancouver because it's warmer.
It's true. And
they don't die.
You know, what I'd heard moving out here was exactly that. And then I come and see it, and I moved out here for school, and my school was literally on the block of our, you know, quote unquote Skid Row. And the book was completely born out of that, and from having interactions with the people who were living on the streets. But Alex, to what you were saying earlier, it is, the book is, it's not biographical. It is a completely heightened, genre-infused version of that. But the hope is that in doing so and making the place grimier and more futuristic or whatever than it is in reality, we, in some sense, in making the city a real live place that's literally consuming its homeless population, that we got to a deeper sense of truth than like a photograph could, like you say. Whether or not we were successful, I'm not sure, but that was certainly the goal.
I mean, that's sort of interesting, because thinking about what Ruth had asked before, and about essentially the role of setting and how you present stuff, I guess I was thinking about at what point in the process, when you're embarking on a new project, does place actually come up? Like what you said there, Lonnie, was, you know, about the move being what inspired it. But you know, if we start with you, so much of your work is centered within people and within the character. So it's sort of at what point is the actual setting, the place, coming into your process?
Very early, like Emma said, I'm also very interested in mood and creating atmosphere. And for me, that's so ingrained in space and setting, and how it's interacting with the character and how the character interacts with it. So whether it's something drawn from my immediate presence, like The Dregs in Vancouver, or my book Black Stars Above, which is set in the 1800s in Canada, it was still, you know, the research I did for that was very much about the place where it was set. And that's sort of And I didn't think about this till now, but really that's where a lot of my books start, is the setting more than anything. And I've realized that I'm more concerned with atmosphere and mood and formalism than I am with plot, perhaps to some of my books' detriment, but that's always what comes up first for me.
And how about for the rest of you? Because I'm sensing from the way people talk that this does actually come first and shapes everything else that comes after, which I don't think is what people always automatically assume.
Oh, for me, it certainly is. I mean, for everything I'm doing, it's like I have some kind of starting point, be it something very specific, like a specific building which has a culture coming out of it and an aesthetic, or say, for example, if I'm going to do something which is about somebody else's place, it's about very fleeting ideas I have. For example, I want to do a book which is set in futuristic Hong Kong, and my uncle lived there for 50 years, and his wife was a Chinese lady, and she died. And I said to him, while she was there, I said, "Did she cook for you?" And he said, "No, she just played mahjong with her friends." And I said, "What did you eat?" And he said, "Well, I ate street food." So this man who lived for 50 years in Hong Kong and ate street food every day, and this is my dad's brother. He had his whole life of what he's doing in Hong Kong. And I have this kind of imagined picture of what he was doing and how he was living. And that's my starting place for a book about futuristic Hong Kong that my colleague is making. And that's my image of it. And then we will build it up from our joint experiences. But it's really, this is the beginning. You start with what you know, and you start with what other people know, and you see something and you build it up from that.
Yeah, is that like to me as well? As like, for example, when I only draw, like in the case of Pretty Deadly, I try to dive as much as possible on those landscape I think could fit for the story. I remember, like, for example, the first arc, I've been like, I don't know, watching a Western per day for 2 months or so, like compulsively. I like cinema a lot, so I can get very compulsive like that. And then when I write my own stories, like normally the first thing I think about is how the world could be like maybe I have an idea I want to talk about or a concept or something, and then I figure out the world or precisely the place in which those characters are going to be, to see how it can affect the characters, to their character, their behaviors, their decisions. Like normally I draw maps like of the locations or of the world itself or of the galaxies, in considering Mirror, for example, which moves like from a very small satellite to asteroid, more likely to a whole galaxy, and I drew those, and it was very funny. and then yeah, like it affects a lot, like because precisely because of what we've been talking about. If you live in a place in where it's raining so much, your character like gets a little different, or than if you live in a hot place with a lot of sun. You won't understand the heat the same way that if you live in a place in which like it's winter all the time. So I think that affects people. And if we go to more extreme situations, like, I don't know, post-apocalyptic stuff or things like that, it has to affect people even more. So to me, it helps me a lot to ground the characters and to develop the personalities. Like my base is like, when I think about characters, normally they are all, I don't like, I work with archetypes, but I try to avoid the stereotypes. Like, so I don't like to play like this guy is evil. Like normally it's all nice people, but they are affected by the circumstances. So I end up thinking a lot of those circumstances, thinking of the place. their experiences I imagine there. So yeah, from the very beginning.
Can we chat a little bit about your stuff, Alex? Because in terms of your work, at least sometimes you sort of might use one place as proxy for another. So you do a little bit of, replacement, sometimes a bit of this for that and things like that in your work. Would you say that's correct? And I guess how would you sort of talk about that and how do you approach it?
It's an interesting one in the sense, well, maybe not for other people, but I did a book called Friendo last year, which was I think late 2018, that I set in LA, and I found weirdly that a lot of the stuff that I was writing was set in LA, just because it seemed to be some sort of weird. For me, it seemed to be the last word in artificiality. And then, in the last couple of years, I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, and actually it's anything but. The place that I was talking about was sort of 1 square mile. It's actually a fantastically vibrant and incredible place. But I had this sort of very, trite notion of it as being this sort of very kind of artificial environment. But it was, I did my homework for Friendo, and it was quite odd. I was going to NYCC and met a pro, on the MTA, and he just said to me, "Oh, so you're not from LA," and that was like the highest compliment I've ever been paid. They thought, having read the book, that I was kind of from there. I'm sure, natives wouldn't think that, but it was nice that at least someone from the US thought that. So I do try and do my homework, but yeah, I mean, a lot of the time I will use places as proxies for others. But it's funny, like my world building tends to come up a lot. So in the last couple of years, I've made sort of concerted efforts to kind of lean more into character. Just because I thought the world building stuff was getting away. Because at the end of the day, we're not map makers, right? We're not map makers. We're storytellers. But in terms of how kind of
it's an arbitrary distinction.
Yeah. No. I got to give you that. I don't know. I mean, I suppose it's place plus emotion. I suppose I felt that kind of an emotional dimension was missing. That I was giving people like maps of Middle Earth, maybe, which are detailed and compelling and maybe beautiful to an extent, if I can be that kind of luxurious with myself. But if you don't have a kind of emotional attachment to it, then it you can only ever frame it, right? You want it to be a kind of living thing. But just recently, I mean, as Alison kind of pointed out, I mean, Alison said to me the other day, "Oh, your stuff is absolutely obsessed with place," and I didn't think it was. That was the first time it had ever occurred to me. And I learned something today. And like Alison, I mean, a book that I've got coming out in a month or so. I wanted to do something to address kind of class in America. So, because I think, a lot of other debates tend to be, used as proxies for class. So I said it in West Virginia, and, I worked with a local writer to kind of give it a very sort of definite sense of place, absolutely did my homework and everything. But funnily enough, and I'm confessing to a degree of kind of, I suppose, moral cowardice here. I've got a lot more trepidation about this one than I have with anything else, because it's set in a very, this is a real place. And I know that all of a sudden, like my head's in the guillotine, right? Like I haven't invented someone, you never invent anything from kind of whole cloth. But even so, all of a sudden I have this kind of tremendously exposed flank where like I'm accountable, right? And if I get it wrong, people are going to be justifiably upset, and I have to eat that. Yeah, it's you know, I mean, I'm sorry, I know I didn't answer the question directly. I was going to follow my own one, but it's an interesting one to suddenly be exposed in that way, you know, because historically, you know, any Los Angeles that I've been working with has been so kind of abstracted that I'm not really accountable. It's, I can just go, oh, well, it's a plastic one, you know, it's a Vegas version of LA. But this is the first time I've ever sort of anchored it in a real time and place.
It's very honest. It's very honest, though, you know, to have that trepidation. And I think, I think where we are, maybe, I don't know, it's my view that calling attention to the fact that it is always somewhat constructed, even when it seems like it isn't, or when it has the right pedigree, by calling attention to the subjectivity of it is essential right now, I think, you know. But I guess somehow we have to be like deliberate and very careful about it, because the truth, you know, there is still, what you're doing is you're making a package for a truth, right? And that's what's important, more so than your ability to maybe the more important than the mimesis, you know, like you're making a little a model, right, of or a map, right, of West Virginia. What's more important is the truth that you're trying to tell, whether or not it is based there specifically or not. You know, and I think, I don't know, for me at this moment in history, what I'm hoping that a lot of artists will get hip to and like kind of take up as their project is working with the audience to break us out of that notion that we're to be fed some sort of believable illusion, and like the value of the thing is whether or not it's, you know, believable or not. You know, we don't have to think about actually what we're looking at.
I think what Ron brings up there is interesting as well, and it's a question we haven't even got to of the fact of why is this important now, and certainly, you know, the responsibility of bringing actual places into it and how you're presenting them, but then also getting back to what the issues are. And really, we've only been able to scratch the surface of all of that, and you know, in a very general sense. I think, you know, we needed to give so much context to the discussion, and in that start unraveling things, and then hopefully everything that's been said since makes a little bit more sense and sheds a little bit of extra light on the incredible work of everyone here. So I think in the description, we'll make sure there's links to everyone's, you know, websites and pages, and certainly so you can check out their work. But I would encourage you to look at everything these fine people have done, because it's all amazing work, of which I'm very proud to just be able to speak to them, and, you know, incredibly proud to share this with you. And I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I, and I would say we have. So thank you for tuning in.